everyone. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Cool. Okay. Awesome to be here, see some familiar faces, other folks that I don't know, a few people I just met, grabbing bagels. So the idea for this, it's not quite a keynote, but more so of like a framing for the kinds of conversations that we want to have today. So I'm a research scientist at IBM Research in the Responsible Tech Research Group. And some of the things that we're about to see are things you already know, maybe things you've experienced yourself, navigating over organizations, but we think this is really important to get our conversation started. So I'm gonna cover three very simple things. First, how did we get here? How did all of us as a community with maybe different approaches, different interests, different stakeholders we respond to, how did we arrive at this moment? And then what are we working on? What does it mean to do assessments, audits, public oversight methods? And then the last thing is, can we do this together? I'm gonna say yes, but really it's up to all of us. And the main question is, if so, how? So let's get started. I think Rebecca might have mentioned, I'm very interested in bringing humanities and social science insights and approaches. I'm a historian of science and technology by training, so I historicize everything. And in that spirit, bear with me, I'm about to historicize us and our community. So the first thing that is worth remarking is that sometime between 2016 and 2019, we saw an explosion of different kinds of public-driven or externally driven kinds of audits over various technologies. Some hiring algorithms, some algorithms that made decisions on people's healthcare outcomes. They were driven by ProPublica, the ACLU, independent researchers like Dr. Bolmwini and Timnit Gebru. We saw a lot of that, and that really raised awareness within the tech industry at large of the kinds of issues that we were being faced with when it came to the deployment of AI systems. And so that is sort of, in some ways, the origins of a lot of these conversations. There were other things that were going on around what has been described as the techlash. So there were a lot of different workers doing public demonstrations against particular uses of technology and things like that. So all of it came together. And as a response, the tech industry had a bit of a moment of reckoning. And part of that included, in some instances, alterations to products and services, modifications so that they would work better. Other times, there were commitments to sunset or not create particular kinds of technologies or not sell them to particular parties. There was also a rise in the instantiation of ethics board, ethics committees, ethics research groups within industry and outside of it. There were conferences that were formed and organizations like All Tech is Human or the Partnership on AI. There's so many different kinds of things that sprung out of this particular moment. Yes, and with that kind of ecosystem that was formed, there was almost like this community of practice that then essentially started working on this, and there was a proliferation of different kinds of techniques and different kinds of methods to start more systematically evaluating and assessing technologies. And so with that, we saw the emergence of, for example, red teaming or bug bounties, or the creation of more robust benchmarks or toolkits for fairness, a lot of participatory methods, or some of the work that my team has been doing, which involves historical analysis and design fiction for futuring and forecasting of different harms. And of course, in addition to that, we started to see a lot of the drafting and consolidation of different regulations, which I'm sure all of us now feel the weight of, that consolidation of regulations, best practices, and guidelines. And some researchers have suggested, and I think in some ways I would personally agree, is that the current moment where we're standing is the consolidation of an assessment, audit, and public oversight industry. Now these services are sold, and there are particular parties that are hired to conduct assessments. There are artifacts that we can sort of interact with that promise to provide the kind of AI oversight. And so, of course, this is not a linear timeline. Folks were proposing algorithmic auditing way before this, since the early 2010s. Some folks noted issues with AI in the 2000s. Not all organizations were created in response to the techlash. Some were created before and actually were participant in highlighting these issues. But this gives us a bit of a rough sketch of how we've arrived at our current AI governance moment. And I want to highlight this for all of us because as we embark into conversations about the future of AI governance and how we're going to respond to it, we need to think about the history that has brought us here, and what about it we want to preserve? What do we want to make sure we don't lose sight of? Personally, for me, a lot of that is the public oversight and the interest of people of making sure that the algorithms that impact their lives work in ways that are beneficial to them. And there's that kind of thing that we maybe want to keep in mind as we move forward. And then the other question is, what do we want to do differently? What haven't we done? What could we explore that's new? As we go over today, just keep these questions in mind and reflect on where you want to locate yourself in this sort of move towards the future of AI governance. Okay. The second thing I want to cover is what we're talking about today. And for that, I bring you a mouthful. So this is a sort of suggested framing for how we might see AI audits, assessment, evaluations, and public oversight methods. Now, I want to caveat to say these things are different. An audit is not the same as an assessment, it's not the same as an evaluation, it's not the same as public oversight. And those are very, very important distinctions. But as a collective, we can think of some things that they have in common, some similar features. And so the first one is that these are components of socio-technical practice, and that as such, they're embedded within a broader system of cultural norms, legal rules, right? They're also very much embedded within organizational processes, whether that organization is a tech company, or a civil society organization, or the government, or international organizations. And they're also things we can sometimes interact with. Sometimes they're material artifacts that have consequences in the material world. And in addition to that, we cannot think of assessments outside of the larger industry of technology production. They're situated within it, and as such, there are implications for the economic incentives behind how assessments are conducted, and it also has implications for the epistemic values, right? I think Rebecca mentioned one thing that I think stuck out with me in relation to this, and is that if the pace of technology is fast, then do assessments also need to be fast, right? And so there are a lot of implications from the embedding of these kinds of evaluations in the technology production ecosystem. And there are a couple of things I think here worth highlighting. The first one is that we can actually detangle all of these different things. Cultural norms affect epistemic values, affect organizational processes, and so on. But if we think of them collectively, but kind of seeing what each of them brings to the table, that might be a helpful way of understanding all the nuances of AI governance. And so cultural norms in particular define the kinds of harms that we care about. That's something that I believe you also mentioned, Rebecca, with All Tech is Human. That was sort of one of the main reasons for convening was how do we identify the right set of harms? That's a largely cultural question. And we sometimes inevitably care more about the harms that affect us or the communities we care about, right? That is immensely cultural. We see this, for example, with the transition for an interest towards safety. We're moving more towards safety. What does that mean? And culturally, what does it mean to invoke the word safety? What do we associate with it? And so we have that cultural element that defines the kinds of harms that we care about, and therefore the areas of focus that we orchestrate AI governance around. The economic incentives are crucial. I work at a tech company. It's a for-profit company. The economic incentives are very evident. But even in constant contexts where that is not that evident, economic incentives really shape the work that we do. And so, for example, the fact that we have proprietary products, that affects all kinds of assessments, external, internal, because there are issues of access. How much can we see inside the technology? Not to mention the fact that a lot of the technologies are not even understood when you have access now, but that is to say economic incentives play a huge role. Now that we move into a audit industry or an AI governance industry, we have evaluation as a service. That's a thing that can be provided. And so what does it mean when a bottom-up, on-the-ground organization is saying, hey, I can do an external audit, and you have Deloitte on the other side saying, hey, we have years of experience, we're professionals, we have an entire team and a dedicated group of people that are going to work on this. That has immense implications for the kinds of assessments and the kinds of evaluations that we are able to do. And of course, the evaluation timeline. Most AI systems want to be brought to people as fast as possible. And with generative AI, it really feels like a race, a crunch time. We'll evaluate rapidly because, businesses need to be competitive. So huge implications for how we run AI governance. There's also the epistemic values. This is one, it's one that I feel very personally because I'm a historian by training. And so oftentimes people are like, well, technical things are very important. And I'm like, yes, but so is history, and so is politics, and so is culture. And so the kinds of epistemic norms that we hold mean that oftentimes findings that come from technical evaluations hold more legitimacy. And that has implications for how we govern AI. At the same time, there's also this question of expertise. I think many of us have brought up the question of expertise. Initially, if we think back at this timeline that I provided in the beginning, some folks that raised issues were experts, but in some other instances, were civil society organizations that say outcomes are a problem because they have expertise on the outcomes, the lived experience of those outcomes. So how we define what an expert is and who belongs at the table has, again, immense implications. So epistemic values are also very important to keep in mind. And then I'll end with organizational processes because we are in a very, very complex technology ecosystem. Of the technologies that I've encountered in my work, rarely is the service that the company I work for is provided the only service. We are working with a ton of different companies that come together to provide one solution. How do we even allocate responsibility? How do we evaluate internally? People mention a lot how external evaluations face the challenge of access. Internal evaluations do too, because you're evaluating your product in relation to a bunch of products you don't have access to. And so organizational processes have a big implication for AI governance, and they also define the sites of intervention. Because if we look at, for example, let's just imagine we look at the outcome of a particular tool, right? And we can intervene in decision-making about the tool. But what about the consultants that sold the tool? Where in the AI governance ecosystem are there? And so to map the organizational processes of all these institutions is very challenging, but again, has implications for the conversations we are going to have around AI governance. So the question for everyone here in the room is, how are you situated within this larger landscape? What are the epistemic values you hold? What are the organizational processes you're familiar with, or you have to contend with, or negotiate around? What are the economic incentives that drive your work or constrain it, right? So all of those are really, really important things that we need to keep in mind as we enter the conversation. And we need to, I think, coming into the next question, really reflect on how our different constraints create gaps in the broader AI governance ecosystem we're forming, and where might we find overlaps so that we can work together, even though we are constrained differently or have different interests and priorities. Okay. Can we do this together? That is, as I said, a question for this group, and of course for people outside this group. But I want to suggest that if we do, there are certain things that we must engage with collectively. The first one is we need to find ways to make our work commensurate, right? So how do we essentially, play on our strengths? How can we make sure that the folks that are closer to, communities impacted by technology have an important role in this broader AI governance ecosystem? How do we make sure that folks that have a lot of technical expertise can deploy it in a way that moves us forward? How can we make sure that institutions that hold a lot of power leverage that power in a way that is conducive to better AI governance? So that is one. How do we make our work commensurate? The second one is we need to integrate and share findings. Of course, we know that it's not always possible to share the minutiae detail of the different AI governance engagements that we do, but we can come together like we're doing today to talk about the challenges, the roadblocks, the things we learned. There are always things that we can communicate to each other, and that is really, really important. So we need to share insights and stay and remain integrated as much as possible. The other thing that I want to suggest is really important for us to do is to be advocates for each other's work rather than have an either-or approach to AI governance. Now, we do need standardization across the history of technology. Regulation requires standardization. We can't get away from it. But even as we standardize different AI governance methods, frameworks, expectations, we can always say yes and. Yes, let's have these standards, let's ensure people comply, and also let's make sure we support alternative methods, or we support the uncovering of new harms or new issues that we might be able to see. So a yes and attitude, I think, is in the spirit of this group, and it's essential to the work that we're going to do. And lastly, I think we need to ask ourselves what is missing. Because right now, the feeling is that AI governance is very important. I think everyone in this room probably is here because they think it's really important. And that it's too vague and too difficult to implement, so we need to be hands-on. But that sense of urgency oftentimes takes us to a place where we don't think about what's missing, because we are so focused on the task at hand. And so I think we constantly need to be asking ourselves this question: what are we missing? What don't we have? What haven't we done? As we also get, hands-on and practical. And so for this, I really want to pose yet another set of questions for the group. You'll see we organized this event around open questions. So we don't bring answers, we pose questions to you. And here's my last set of questions, which is, what do you need to see from others? And what do you need from others to make sure that we can work together? Because the truth is, not all our approaches share the same politics or the same vision, right? So what do you need to see from the people in the room to make sure that we can drive assessments, audits, public oversight towards a more robust AI governance ecosystem that remains grounded in the early reasons why this group got together in the first place? And so that's my brief yay. Thank you so much for listening and bearing with the historian. And if you're interested, we did a shameless plug of some of our recent research papers. So you're welcome to check those out. And thank you so much for gathering together.